Good evening, Cousin Campbells. As I've promised for so long, the procrastination has come to an end. I am finally going to tell you the Campbell story, and I hope and pray that most of my story is pretty accurate. I imagine Cletus could clarify some of the areas, but let me tell you how I know it after my mother's many stories of her family. It is Friday, February the 9th at 9:15 p.m. Let me start with the story of the Campbells in County Louth. Mother used to often say that one of our relatives, probably a great-great-grandfather, worked for Lord Claremont. He evidently was in charge of selecting his beautiful horses. Aunt Kitty used to say he was a jockey, but I would like to think that he did select beautiful horses, and I hope this has not ever caused a gambling streak in the family. Kitty Campbell, who would have been our great aunt, was the oldest of the Campbell family at the time, and she fell in love with Einie Hines. And Einie had a very menial job. He was a hod carrier. He was the one that would bring the mortar to the bricklayers. Well, the Campbell family felt that Einie wasn't worthy of their lovely daughter, and they absolutely positively refused to allow her to marry him. She was 17 at the time. Back in those days of Ireland, with their very Victorian approach to life, they figured out the only thing that Einie and Kitty could do is force the family to accept them. So Kitty stayed overnight at Einie's home. His parents were there. They did not sleep together, but they were there. And back in those days, a young lady that stayed overnight at a man's home would naturally have to be married by the dear gentleman, because it would have been scandalous. So they were married, and the Campbell family completely ostracized Kitty and treated her as if she never existed. I often wonder about that good Catholic upbringing that some of those people had. Well, Kitty became pregnant, and when her pregnancy was at the 3 months period, her dear mother became pregnant. And it was at that time, finally, all the barriers broke down, and the mother and daughter renewed their love and friendship, and I guess the father eventually came along with the whole idea. Kitty gave birth to Einie Hines' son, whom they named Edward. 3 months later, Kitty gave birth to her son. That was Kitty as the mother, gave birth to her son, Patrick. So actually, the uncle was 3 months younger than the nephew. Things were really rough in Ireland at that time. They had the plagues or the Irish famines and all the other things. So Einie made arrangements to take his young wife and son over to America. They traveled in the steerage part of the boat, which is practically the lowest part of the boat, and it was a very, very poor arrangement, but it did get them out of Ireland. So they came to this country. I don't know the details of how they happened to get to Chicago, but finally they settled in Chicago, and the rest has been pretty much history, because as we all know, Edward did grow up, established the Edward Hines Lumber Company, and became a millionaire. He purchased a beautiful home for his mother in Evanston, and his family consisted of Edward Hines Jr., who was an officer, a lieutenant commander, and a lieutenant in the Air Force in World War I. He was in the trenches with his troops. He could have easily been, with all the political connection that his father had, he could have probably never had to go into the service, but Edward did, and he eventually died as a result of a serious illness he contracted in the trenches, and he is commemorated in the Chicago Historical Society and he is buried in the tomb out in Mundelein. But back to the original story. So they were settled in Chicago. In the meantime, my mother and all of her sisters. Oh, there's a few things I forgot to mention. I was going to give you the family heritage. I'm ahead of myself, but we'll overlook that. Senility is setting in. Patrick, our grandfather, was formally educated, and he came over to Buffalo at age 23, and he was teaching in Buffalo, New York. He married a nurse, and both his wife and child died in childbirth. And at age 24, he left America and returned to County Louth. At that time, the only one left of his family was his maiden sister, Ellen. They lived on the family farm. I don't know what supported them, but understand at that time, Patrick was probably the only educated person in the town, because the English would not allow the Irish to be educated. So he would write all the letters for his dear neighbors to America, and he would read the letters when they came back from America. So consequently, he was the most honest, honorable man in town. He was very brilliant, and there wasn't an instrument that he couldn't play. Well, at age 38, he went to Mass, as regularly he did on a Sunday, and in church was this very beautiful Irish colleen, Rose McIntyre. She was just about 17 at the time. Well, here he is, age 38, a widower. He falls madly in love with this beautiful young Irish colleen. His sister Ellen was horrified. She even proceeded to tell him she doubted if he'd live long enough to see a single child. With that great encouragement, Patrick did marry Rose McIntyre, and they settled on the family farm. I don't know what happened to Ellen. She probably went off somewhere in the stew, and I know that the name was banished from the family. If you'll notice, there's not an Ellen in the single family. But he married her, Rose McIntyre, who was our grandmother, and he proceeded to father 9 children. You can imagine what a situation that was when he proposed to Rose, because Rose, as many of the other people in that area, was completely illiterate, and I'm very sorry to say she died illiterate. I don't know why he didn't try to educate her. Maybe that is how they managed to have a good marriage. But Rose had not reached her womanhood until she was 18. The 9 children that she bore, and I think Cletus might have some accurate information on this. The oldest is Patrick Jr. That's Winnie's father. Eugene, I believe there was a William, and then Michael and Joseph. Your father was the youngest of the family. The girls were Rose, Elizabeth, Margaret, my mother, and Sarah. I know my mother was the 7th. I believe Sarah was the 8th, and your father was the 9th. Dear Rose, Grandma Rose, who was not ever educated, made sure that all of their children were educated. The boys were all sent to the Royal Irish Constabulary, which would be comparable to our West Point. And all the girls were formally educated. My mother was completely educated in Latin, Greek, all phases of mathematics. She could quote Shakespeare. She was just an outstanding, brilliant woman. And I know your father had the same education. Rose was trained in home economics. Elizabeth was trained in office procedures. Margaret, my mother, after her formal training, it was decided that she should learn professional training. She studied up in the town of Dundalk. And Sarah had a general education, but really she was the farm girl of the family. She preferred to stay at home. The Royal Irish Constabulary headquarters was in County Cork. That's why your father had a brogue, because the area of County Louth, they speak more of a Chaucer English. They were professionally trained to be peace officers. The training was very rigorous, similar to the Marines. In order to come into the Royal Irish Constabulary, you had to be completely educated and no skeletons in the closet. And this was definitely the way it was set up. Your father at that time was 17 years old, and he proceeded to study industriously and was going to make a mark for himself. And he definitely felt that he too, like all of his previous brothers, would be very successful. Well, as we all know, in many organizations, there's always a rotten apple. And there happened to be one. It was a captain. And he proceeded to take your father under his sinister wing. And I believe he's the one that taught your father how to drink. Not that a person has to learn how to drink, but he's the one that exposed your father to alcoholism. Now, another captain's daughter, maybe Cletus knows more about this because he did meet them, she fell in love with your dad, and she became pregnant, and they were forced to marry. Rose Campbell, the oldest girl at that time, drew out all of her postal savings, and which at that time was a considerable amount of money, and she booked passage to America, helping Joe escape his situation. They showed up at my mother's door. I don't know just what time of the year it was, but probably in around, I think, 1920, if I'm tracing back family ages. My folks were living in an apartment in Chicago on the north side, and their children were Margaret, William, and James. I showed up about 4 years later. I think it's in around 1920 because I know Mother said Jim was 2 years old when they moved to Hamilton Avenue. So tracing back, it'd be about that. Rose told my mother the whole story, and they lived with them for a short time. Rose got a job due to her home economics training. She became a professional cook in one of the Gold Coast mansions in Chicago. She eventually died of breast cancer. Joe got a job with Edward Hines. He was trained to be a professional wood grader. His good looks and his charm dazzled the young ladies. No one in the family knew of his marriage. Edward decided then, I don't know if he found out about it or just what it was, but Edward decided to send him up to Park Falls to the lumber mill up there. His sister and her husband, their name fails me at this time, managed the plant. Again, his good looks and his charm dazzled the town of Park Falls. Your mother was so unbelievably in love with your father, and he asked her to marry him. The Hines relatives told the pastor about his marriage. Evidently, your father told a very convincing story to the pastor. He alluded to the fact that the Hineses were so snooty and that they didn't want him marrying a farm girl. So evidently the pastor bought it, and he did marry them. Your dear father, bless his troubled soul, entered the RIC at age 18. And really, he had no idea of life. His situation was a very sad situation, and he thought perhaps by escaping to America and getting a new start in life that eventually he could leave all of this behind him. Now maybe you can understand why he was constantly fighting the demons. Your father had to fight all of his life. Alcohol was his only escape. When my darling sister Margaret died, February 6, 1940, my mother wouldn't let me call your folks because she was concerned that your father would disgrace her if he came down to the funeral.
Your father was devastated. I pleaded. I was only 17 at the time, but Mom wouldn't let me. We drove up to visit your folks that summer after my sister's death, and I felt so bad when we told your dad. He cried like a baby. He was more to be pitied than censored. I doubt if he ever had a happy day from age 17. The one glorious accomplishment in his life was fathering a wonderful family. Your dear mother truly could be canonized for her life. All that we can say and surmise at this time is he has been judged, and let's pray his soul is at rest. You are all a healthy, intelligent adults and true survivors. Your faith, like mine, has and will carry us through. It is awful hard for us to judge because most of us don't know what's in the past. I know, Cletus, you were aggravated with me because I never told the family story. I didn't feel it was my obligation. I respected your dear mother so much, I didn't want to bring any more sorrow into her life. I never thought that Winnie, Patrick's daughter, would blab like she did, so you'll forgive me for not letting you know the story, but I don't know what good it would have done. I would be very interested in knowing about his wife and daughter who are in New York, because these are the things that I don't have much details on. At this time, I would like to explain how my mother happened to come over to America. Edward Hines' sister and her husband, Mr. Chris Wee, who was vice president of the Hines Lumber Company, had come over to Ireland to visit the relatives. My mother at that time was 26, and she was studying the tailoring. They came out to the farm, and Sarah was the only one at home. Sarah was the homespun one of the family. She just loved feeding the chickens and whatever it took to keep things going. By then, I believe, I don't know if Patrick was still living, the father, but she offered to sponsor Sarah over to America. That was the only way you could come over to America. So Sarah said no, she was perfectly happy living there at home. And but when Mother came home, Mother was up in Dundalk at the time, and when Mother came home the next weekend, Sarah was telling her about the rich relatives from Chicago that had come out and offered to sponsor her. So Mother wrote to them and asked if they would sponsor her. Mother was not comfortable living in Ireland. She aspired to greater things. And Mother in her day was quite tall. She was 5'7", which is standard size now, and absolutely exquisite woman. She had pitch black hair with a little patch of white underneath. Excellent seamstress. So she received a letter from Louise, said yes, they would sponsor her. So she sewed up a glorious wardrobe, and she boarded a ship, and she landed in Boston, and she came down to Chicago by train. In the length of time that she had left Ireland and came to Chicago, Chris Wee's wife, I don't quite remember what her name was, had died of pneumonia. So Mother arrives in this gorgeous home. If you've ever seen the movie, in British movies, upstairs, downstairs, it was that kind of an arrangement. They had upstairs maids and downstairs maids. And here's Chris Wee, a very rich, handsome widower, who receives my mother into his home per the arrangements. Evidently, those little witches of the maids made life so miserable for Mother. They always would refer to somebody coming from Ireland as the greenhorn, and it just aggravated them that she arrived and was treated so royally when they were just of servant status. So Mother made some other arrangements. Then Kitty Bronson, her name was Kitty Sheppy, and then Bronson was her married name, was my mother's cousin. That was the strain of family that came from the Hines side of the family. My mother was from the Patrick side, the original family, and Kitty's relatives. Her mother, Agnes, was a relative, a cousin of Edward Hines. So Kitty took my mother in, and Mother thought that'd be a beautiful escape. But dear Aunt Kitty, who was my godmother, we called her Aunt because of her age, she actually was a cousin, proceeded to make my mother's life completely miserable. She was a busybody. She would have people come over and see the Irish greenhorn, and Mother was sort of showcased, as it were. So eventually she just figured she had to make some other kind of arrangement. She really wasn't interested in pursuing the sewing, but one of the things she had told me that Kitty took her down to Marshall Fields, and they were in this very elite, exquisite dress section of Marshall Fields, and this sales lady began to fuss about my mother and commenting on what a beautiful woman she was. At that time she was a perfect 36, and they would bring out velvet capes and different things and be draping them on her. So finally the manager of the store, or that particular department, came up to my mother and asked her if she would become a professional model for them, because she was the exact size of Mrs. Potter Palmer, the millionaire's wife in Chicago, and it would be so wonderful that they could fit all the clothes on my mother for Mrs. Potter Palmer. Mother, being new to the area, did not understand exactly what they were talking about. Kitty, who was only about 5'2" and probably weighed about 170 at the time, went into a complete rage and said that no relative of hers was ever going to be a model, and just would not allow my mother to go ahead with that. So in the meantime, Edward Hines' mother, who was living out in her mansion in Evanston, offered a home for my mother. So Mother moved out with Mrs. Hines, and evidently in personal conversation my mother had said that she would like to be office trained. So Mrs. Hines sponsored her at Etna Business College. Mother was completely trained to be a professional secretary, shorthand, typewriting, and the whole works. My father, who had migrated from Nebraska, was taken out of school at age 4 because he was a big strapping boy, and his father figured he could make money firing tile furnaces, would not let him complete his education, which was a very devastating thing in my father's life. He did become self-educated and practically supported the family all of his life, not alone ours, but his leechy relatives. But my father was what they called a freight solicitor, and he was so successful. He had worked all the way from being a firebox tile furnace, working there, and then he did get a job. He learned the Morse code. He worked for the railroad. He would check the fireboxes when the trains came in, and eventually moved from Nebraska to Kankakee, Illinois, traipsing the whole family along with him. He and his mother and father and the 4 children, 5 counting him. And then he did get up into Chicago and settled a family in the South Side at 3846 South Ellis. And being a freight solicitor, became very successful, so he needed a secretary. And he called the school to see if they had a recent graduate, and they said yes, they had Margaret Campbell. So Margaret Campbell came out to meet William R. Miller, freight solicitor, and that's how they met. She became a secretary, and they fell in love, and my mother married my father and moved in with that real strange family of his. I never did question her about that. And that was the beginning of our family. They lived out in the South Side, and then Margaret was born December the 19th, it'd be 70 years ago, because she'd be 74. She was 7 years older than I am. So she was 74. But then when they got their own apartment on the north side, then they had Bill. He was 22 months after Margaret, and then they had Jim, who was 17 months after Bill. So that was the family when your father and Rose showed up at the front door. But Mother had no contact with her family. I mean, she had gone back when she was engaged. So my dad's business became very, very successful, and they fully intended to go back to Ireland because Mother was so proud of her American husband and her 3 beautiful children. So they had planned to go back because financially they were in a position to do it in 1921. And then Mother found out that she was pregnant, and God bless them, I was the pregnancy, and I was born March 9th, 1922. Good grief, I'll be 68 next month. But that sort of took care of the Irish trip, and Mother never did get back to Ireland, and that's one of the many reasons I'm called Kathleen, because I was born in Ravenswood Hospital in Chicago, and they had on my little imprint with my big footprints and Mother's thumbprints, Baby Miller, because at that time they really hadn't named me, and I guess my mother began to think of her Irish trip, so she called me Kathleen, and it was sort of after Aunt Kitty because she was my godmother, and then my father's parents, his mother was Catherine. The amazing thing is my father's grandparents were also from County Louth. My grandmother's maiden name was Carol, and they had come over probably in around the time that Annie Hines and Kitty came. And when people ask me my heritage, I tell them that I'm Irish, but I always have a little problem explaining the maiden name of Miller, and that is basically from my grandfather, my dear grandmother, married in Nebraska. So I'm 1/4 Kraut, I guess I would say, and 3/4 Irish. But I've been very blessed because being the youngest of the family, and Margaret died when I was 17, and then Bill and Jim married and moved out. So I had the opportunity to be with my parents and hear their story. I'm going to tape the story of the Miller family for all of my cousins on that side because, as they say in literature, I'm the last of the Mohicans, and I'm the only one that has the knowledge of what has happened in the family. I hope at this time that I've been able to explain pretty much what our heritage is. We can be proud of it because our dear grandmother saw to it that all were educated. It's amazing from the way Mother told the story. The father, Patrick, was sort of come see, come saw about it, whether they were educated or not, and here he was the most brilliant man. The poor darling little lady was never educated. I suppose that in itself could be a story. What do you do, keep them barefoot and pregnant? I don't know. But Rose McEntee Campbell died, I'd say probably about 12 years after Patrick, or maybe it was longer. I know she died. So we have never been blessed with grandparents from that side of the family. We do have a bunch of relatives up in Buffalo, but at this point I don't know their names. I know that Mother's sister Sarah settled in Manchester. During the Irish Rebellion, the fact that the whole Campbell family had been educated by the English in the Royal Irish Constabulary, they were classified as traitors, and they went through some hellish nights with the Irish Army, Renegade Army, coming to their door. And this one time, Sarah and her husband were visiting, and her husband had to run out into the ocean and hide out in a rock formation, and the tide came in and chilled him so severely that he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. He was very arthritic and just had a horrible time. But the Campbell family went through an awful lot because of the family's training of the Royal Irish Constabulary. They were never trusted by the ordinary Irish people, so I think we can relate that to many of the infighting that there is still in Ireland in the different areas. But I'm hoping and praying that next year I will be able, in the year 91, that I'll be able to get over to Ireland to see the birthplace of our parents, And at that time, I hope to bring Greg's daughter, who is Erin, and she will be 11 at that time. I feel so sorry to think I haven't had the opportunity before, but going into business after Jerry died has been a little hectic, to say the least. He said to me that if anything happened to him, I'd be without a retirement, which he'd gotten a lump sum after he left. So I told him if I couldn't get a job with my big mouth, I would starve to death, and I could afford to shed at least 20 pounds like tomorrow. But as I said, we have the faith, and what I'm trying to understand is there all my handsome cousins are retiring. Thank God Marty's still in there pushing around. I don't intend to retire for God knows when. If there's something to peddle, I will peddle it to my dying day. 2 more years, I will be able to keep on pedaling and still get my Social Security. I haven't seen that in quite a few years. But I am very, very blessed with good health. I survived a gallbladder explosion up at a fancy hotel in San Francisco. I was at the pearly gates and I heard them slammed again. Then I tripped the Light Fantastic down at the college theater in downtown City College and proceeded to step off a 3-foot drop. And believe me, all I was drinking was a cup of coffee at the time, and I hit the concrete sidewalk. That was the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, November 28th. And all I managed to do was conk the right side of my right brow, and they could not believe at the hospital I didn't break a single bone. My one concern was my new implants. I've had an implant. My cataracts are removed. I have an implant, both eyes. One was February and one was August. My thin retina, which they were concerned about, is still intact. And my wound is so minor you wouldn't even know it's there. It's just 3 stitches in the brow line. So I guess I'm to have longer days. I've been put together with concrete and steel, and I've got the stamina of a horse. And with all that great opportunity, I hope to be able to carry on. And God knows, I would love to have any one of you come out and visit me. I live in beautiful San Diego. You have cousins out here. The remaining children, Jerry, who is 44, lives in Laguna Beach. His 3 children are Jerry Jr., or rather Kathleen, 22. She made me a great-grandmother. Her son is 5. Jerry is 20. He's in the Air Force over in Arizona. And Laura's 19, and she's in her 2nd year at University of California at Irvine. Jerry survived a disastrous marriage of 15 years. His wife was alcoholic for 7 of those. He has since remarried and has a wonderful wife and has a great future ahead of him. He's an electrical engineer. His degree is from Marquette, and his company was bought out by Arizona Utilities, and he's working completely from his home. He's the West Coast contact for the entire STAG organization within the utilities. Greg has 2 children. Aaron is now 9, and Stephen is 4, and he's a controller for Pacific Triangle Cabinet Company out of Plano, Texas. His dear wife, Sue, is vice president of what used to be Republic Bank. It's now North Carolina Bank. She's one of the few that survived the tremendous upheaval in the Texas banking situation. They are very happily married. In fact, they're the longest married of any of my children. They'll be married 19 years this June. Laureen, my beautiful one and only daughter, who is just a recreation of my mother. I look at her, those beautiful eyes that turn colors with joy and sorrow. She's married for the 2nd time. Her boys are 16 and a half, and Jeff will be 14 on the 22nd of February. I plan to take those 2 young men with me to Chicago in June for a convention, and I want them to see our city. I'm anxious to see them go up in the 123rd floor of the Sears building and all the exciting things. The convention will be a total of 4 days, and then I'm going to rent a car and stay in dear Chicago and have them meet the Miller side of the family. Bill's family still lives back there. He died at age 53 and left a family of 8. His youngest was 5, and his dear wife, Jane, has managed to keep the company intact. The boys are now president, vice president. She's chairman of ABC Anderson Brothers Storage, and she still lives in the family home. She too has never remarried. I guess when you have your one and only love, you never do that. Then Kevin is our environmental graphic designer. He's got his master's from San Diego State. He lives nearby, about 15 miles, in El Cajon, California. Their oldest, Marie, is a Down syndrome baby, but doing fine. She has a hole in her heart, but they're afraid to operate on it because her lungs often are in hypertension and it isn't safe. So they've been told she could live to be a teenager or she could die of heart failure at any time. But they were big and brave and went on to have another remarkable baby girl. Her name is Michelle. She's a year and a half. And I have never, and I'm not being a proud grandmother, but I have never seen a baby so brilliant. She walked at 10 months, and she's got a complete vocabulary and speaks in sentences. She's going to be the big sister for Marie. It's a blessing. They have been so blessed. They themselves can't believe how much she's accomplished in her little 15 or 16 months. Kevin is very successful in his business and has some great projects here in town. Philip, our youngest, is 35. He just turned 35, and he's been in real estate since he's 20. He was a vice president of Caldwell Banker in their corporate office in Irvine. His wife, he was married 2 years ago, June, and his wife came out of the sales she was in and went into real estate. Her first job, selling out of their office in Laguna Beach, was to an Egyptian, the same man that bought Farouk's Palace. He bought a $1.5 million oceanfront home without batting an eyelash and paid cash for it. So Philip decided he better get back in sales, and he was offered a real estate company, Edgewater Realty, that had been in existence for 30 years. The owner wanted to retire. She was in her 80s, and she selected Philip and his former boss, vice president, retired now from Caldwell Banker, helped finance him, and he bought the real estate company as of the 1st of December, and his wife is working with them, and they have a little girl. Her name is Tori. So I have 10 grandchildren, 6 girls and 4 boys, and my great-grandson, Sean Stanton. Presently, I'm very busy. I'm still out peddling my plastic corner guards and then deco guard. My competitor decided the only way to get control of me was to hire me, so they took me in the franchise 6 years ago. And 3 years ago, they spun me off on the architectural side and gave me the franchise at Deco Guard. My territory is San Diego and Imperial County. I love what I'm doing. It's straight commission, which can be pretty horrendous at times, but I'm my own boss. I work completely from home. I'm still involved in the school district. I had been teaching a veterans class, but now because of the death of the GI Bill, I no longer have the class because the GI Bill is not financing the veterans education, and you can all appreciate that because I know the majority of you used your GI Bill to get your education. Well, it died a very quiet death on December the 31st, 1989. So that part of the school has closed for me, is no longer, which in a way is a little easier because it took a lot of time to put an 18-week syllabus together and maintain a course. I am still in the work experience division where I go out and meet students on the job site, and being a gadabout, I'm finally getting paid for doing something I enjoy. They pay me good wages to go out and visit the students in their various jobs, which invariably are gorgeous hotels, restaurants, country clubs, and aside from that, they give me 24 cents a mile. Last year, they virtually paid for all my gas. So, I have the best of all worlds. Now, Tuesday, my original agent retired. I'm a member of the Screen Actors Guild and of AFTRA, which is the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. You have to be in both of those because you never know when you go on an audition, if it's going to be filmed, then it's Screen Actors Guild. If it's going to be taped, then it's AFTRA. So I have to maintain both unions. I have not had any activity in a year and a half since my agent retired, but I did affiliate with another agent. And at this time, there hasn't been anything too much, but I guess with the Mrs. Bush look, I figured I've lived long enough. My look is in style. I have a casting on Tuesday for one of the great hospitals here in the area. They have a whole women's division, and they want to do a taping for a typecast grandmother. And I'm hoping I get it, because it could be a very worthwhile, because the union pays $415 a day for any taping. It has to be done within 8 hours. If it goes beyond that, then you get a time and a half and double time. I did a nationwide. Hello, I'm back again. I had a phone call. You heard the phone ring. Back to the final wrap-up of this tape. We did have an Uncle Michael, that's Mother's and Joe's brother. He lived in Montreal. He and his son Desmond came down to visit Mother and Dad and myself quite a few years ago. That's well before my parents are gone. My mother died February 6, 1950, and Dad died February the 27th, 1955. As I told you, my sister Margaret died February 6, 1940. My brother Bill died at age 53, left his family of 8, and he died about 19 years ago, and Jim died about 6 years ago at age 61. So, truly, I'm the last of the Mohicans. As I said, Michael came to visit us, and my brother Bill was on vacation, so he allowed Desmond to stay in his home, and he proceeded to rip off the place considerably. So be careful if you hear of a Desmond Campbell. Stay clear of him. He's not the most honorable person. The brother Michael Jr., who I believe still lives in Montreal, is very honorable. He called to apologize. I have never heard any more from Uncle Michael or any of the family, but I think they're still up in Montreal, because Uncle Michael worked at McGill University. So that pretty much takes care of the family. Again, I want to reiterate that I'd be so happy to have any one of you come out to visit me. I'm Mrs. Kathleen M for Mary, Immel, I-M-M-E-L. My address is 6574A Bell, B-E-L-L, Bluff, B-L-U-F-F Avenue, San Diego, California, 92119. My phone number, both home and business, is area code 619-286-6882. It's a beautiful town. I would be more than happy to take you around and show you the gorgeous place, and we're just 20 minutes from Tijuana. I go down there quite often, so we can make that a trip. I have a 2-bedroom townhouse, but I use one of the bedrooms for my office. So I have a hide-a-bed if you want real togetherness, or there's some real nice budget motels nearby. A wrap-up on our family. We too have lost a child. He was Richard William, our 5th son, our youngest boy. He would have been 30 last August. He died August 3rd, 1960. Died of 3rd-degree burns. We had a terrible accident happen. Weed killer exploded and engulfed him completely. I was standing right virtually next to him when it happened. When you're here, I'll share the details. But that loss is always with you. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that is gone forever. I'm just grateful to God that I've been fortunate enough to be able to start a business, get involved in teaching, and stay single. course, the older I get, the easier it is. But I have no intentions of going down the middle aisle unless he has a couple of million. Otherwise, forget it. I hope that I've been able to acquaint you with the family, give you some understanding, and pray for you and all of you, and hope you will pray for your dear father. I hope Mary is feeling better. I know she's in new quarters. You told me that, Pat. So please be in touch with me and let me know how things are going. It would be the happiest day for me to have you meet my family. Of the remaining 5, 4 are here in California. How about the Irish music? I won this record from the Royal Hibernians, or whatever they call us. So I put it on every now and then to remember our roots. God bless all of you, and please come out and see me.
Once again,